Well, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are, hopefully watching this. Welcome back to another episode of Cardboard Kitchen. Got a couple of things I'm going to talk about today, but real quick, if you're new here, basically this is a podcast where I talk about Magic the Gathering, specifically the Commander format. I myself have been playing for 24, potentially going on 25 years. And so I talk about various things for the Commander format as far as like maybe rules and interactions and things that newer players might like to know. If you're new to Magic the Gathering, I highly recommend the Commander format. You can play MTG Arena, you can play MTGO. I personally don't recommend it, but if you are new to the game and you want to get your magic fix, so to speak, those are some alternatives to the Commander format that are probably going to be on the cheaper side, if you're trying to like not spend a whole bunch of money. So if you're new, welcome. Like, share, subscribe, hit that thumbs up, hit that notification bell, leave a comment, all that fun stuff. But we're going to get into it. So first things first for tonight's video, it's night where I'm at. Somebody had asked about my color ranking system and why I have it the way that I have it and whether or not I like specific colors more than others. So my actual color ranking system is in three groups. These groups, we're going to start with, your delicious meat and potatoes. Very, very delicious garlic buttered steak, all that fun stuff. Your herb garlic buttered mashed taters, all that fun stuff. All of that's going to be the color green. It's basically the color green. And the reason I say that is because I'm a green player at heart. That's my personal opinion, is that's essentially your green is your delicious, properly prepared steaks, mashed taters, all those fun things I haven't had in a long time. Probably won't have for a little while longer, unfortunately. The second tier is going to be your desserts or sauces, depending. I'm more of a sauce person than a dessert person, but it could be your desserts. So they're like you're just the finalizing cherry on top of the sundae or whatever. And those colors, because it's multiple colors. Those colors are actually the color of white, blue, and black. They all have some piece of themselves that are unique that usually they are really, really good at. Black is kind of a jack of all trades and can do a little bit of everything. Not really. There are a couple things black still can't do, and that's okay. Black doesn't need to do some of those things because the one thing that they do extremely well is all the critters are dead, or search for any card I want. Black's pretty good at that. And then your final coloring, if you haven't figured it out, is going to be your absolutely disgusting salads. There are some salads that are okay. I'm a big fan of Caesar salads, but most of the places that I've gone to have like house salads and things of that nature, they're actually not that great. So this is kind of your house salad color, and that's red. In my personal opinion, that's going to be red. And the reason that's going to be red is because I don't feel like red does enough in the game of Magic by itself. I don't feel like it does enough comparatively to all the other colors. All the other colors can do kind of multiple things. Black can kind of do everything except flat destroy an artifact. I don't think I've seen a way to just outright destroy target artifact in black. But it can kill creatures. It has ways to kill enchantments. It can kill lands. It can draw you cards. It can tutor, I don't think it can bounce yet, which is kind of blue's predominantly signature thing that only blue can do. Um, but like black can kind of do it all. White is slowly getting better in the card draw department. It's still very finicky in the card draw department because like you're playing cards that are like I get to draw cards, but then I have to let somebody else also draw cards, and it's eh. I mean, white's all about like law and order and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of fits for white. Like you shouldn't be the only person drawing cards. I guess it's kind of fair on their downside as somebody else also gets to draw cards. Um, but one thing white does extremely well is keywords on creatures, um, exile instead of destroy. That's a big one for white. Um, green is literally your meat and potatoes. Or if you're a sauce guy, it's that handmade, peppered gravy or whatever the case is. Or it's the melted butter that gets used when cooking your steak or your filet mignon or whatever the case is. Um, greens, green doesn't necessarily tutor extremely well. The tutors that green does have either find you lands or find you creatures specifically. But green's got a lot of like catch-all stuff. Green's got some damage-based spells, which is kind of what red does. Um, it's got some bounce mechanics, but it's mostly like bounce your own stuff. So it's not fully into the blue portion of bouncing other people's things. It'll bounce its own stuff. Um, but that's sprinkled here and there. You've got destroy artifacts. You've got destroy enchantments. Red's predominantly big thing is damage to all creatures and just outright destroy artifacts. Those are its two big things, and I personally don't think that's enough against the other colors, just because it's really not when all the other colors can do so much. Like that's the other big thing red can do that you don't see is red can flat out just say my opponents can't search their libraries whatsoever. But that's like 1, 2, maybe 3 cards in the entirety of red. There's a planeswalker in blue black that'll do it, that has a static ability that does it. And there's a card in white. It won't stop, but it'll limit like what they can search. It's called Avid Mind Sensor. It lets them only search the top 4 whenever they search. So it doesn't stop them from searching, but they can only dig 4 cards to find what they're looking for. And that's kind of something that red does, but it's so sparse and really only hurts black players. Really predominantly only hurts black players because black's the only one that's tutoring an absolute ton. I think there's 1 or 2 white cards that'll make it so that you have to pay mana to search. But whoever's turn it is can pay the mana, and then they get to search their deck as many times as they want or whatever. Like, you only have to pay the mana once. And then, so yeah, green kind of does more of everything than any of the other colors except for searching in black and bouncing, which blue predominantly does. Blue has a lot of flying creatures, a lot of bounce effects. Blue predominantly has counter spells. Blue's not the only color that has counter spells. There are counters available in actually every color, but depending on which ones you're using, that could be very specific. Like red has access to counter spells, but they're very specific about countering blue things. Blue's got your catch-all counters that can counter anything. Blue's got your specific counter red spell type stuff. Blue's even got counter spells that'll counter strictly creatures. They've got counter spells that'll counter strictly non-creatures. Blue's just got an assortment of counters to use. It's ridiculous. And that's kind of where I am on the colors. Is green's at the top, white, blue, and black are all one tier below that. and then red is the tier below that, and then that's how it works for me. Just because I really don't feel like red does enough. Like, the tutors that red does have, the drawback to those tutors is you're either getting rid of the thing that you tutored for if you're unlucky. Like, most of the stuff that red does, you have to be super lucky at. Red's got ways to recycle their graveyard, but it's all like, do it at random. So it's like, oh, I've got 10 things in my graveyard. I get one back randomly, and I need it to be one of these, one specific thing out of the 10. But you get a 1 in 10 shot of getting it, which is very low. The thing that red does very, very well is damage. But that damage is usually, in Commander, it's usually more specifically to your opposing players. And I know a lot of you will probably argue, well, that's how you win games, is, damaging the opponents. And it's like, yes, damaging your opponents is how you win games most of the time. But when you as a red player spend your turn, like, I'm going to, spend 5 minutes taking my turn and doing X number of things, but my damage output for the entire turn is like 3, maybe 4 damage to each opponent. That's not a whole lot comparatively. Red does damage, and red throws damage around like crazy most of the time. But most of the things that I've seen as far as red throwing damage, unless you're playing all the things that double or triple damage, or things that are just like, if it does X amount, instead it does amount Y, or whatever the case is, like, unless you're throwing those things out there, most of the damage effects are 1, 2, maybe 3 per an instance of every time the trigger happens. Whereas, like, all the other colors could literally be like, yeah, I've only got one thing dealing damage, but when it hits you, it's going to deal 10, 15, 20, whatever the case is. Red's like, I've got 1,100 things hitting you, but it's only hitting you for one at a time. And only like 2 or 3 of these things are going to trigger, maybe, if red's got the right setup, maybe every turn. So, like, you got all these different things that'll do damage, but everything's got you have to meet requirements. You have to meet specific requirements in order to do this damage or whatever. All the other colors are like, I got a big critter, and it's punching you, and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't know, just, sorry, red, I really don't think you do enough. I mean, yes, it was mentioned in another video. I think it was a Game Nights video. Might have been a Game Nights TikTok or whatever. It popped up on my YouTube page as well, like one of those shorts. And somebody had said, red, the one thing that red does really well is it turns game actions into damage. Yes, that is correct. Red turns game actions into damage. Red does not turn every game action into damage. It can, but it typically doesn't. If it does, you as the red player die first, because your opponents get tired of having to take damage from their game actions, period. So when your opponents are like, I will do game action whatever, take 2 damage, but my game action where I take 2 damage results in you, the red player, taking 10, okay, that's fine. I'll take the 2 to deal you 10 in order to win some kind of a race to get you out of the game faster so that we don't have to worry about it. And that's just another reason that I feel that red is at the bottom of the totem pole as far as, the ranking system for the colors. And that's, I don't know, I would say red's probably the most fair color out of all the colors in Magic, believe it or not, because most of what red does is universal. It affects everybody. So, like, you as the red player, you could play a card called Mana Barbs. It's 3 in a red. It's an enchantment. it says whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player takes a damage. It affects everybody, including the person playing the card. So it's fair. Where it's slightly less fair is the fact that I get to play it, and then I don't have to worry about it until I try to use a land again. Because at that point, like if it's your fourth, if you're the red player and you've basically played everything on curve and you've not played any kind of mana ramp of any sort, no ramp spells, no ramp artifacts, no nothing, you're playing it on turn 4, which is fair because it cost 4. You're tapping out to do it, so you can't have any kind of red shenanigan stuff left over to try and do on the turn cycle. But you're the last person affected by it, you know? Like, you're going to play that, it's going to sit, hopefully it's going to sit there, somebody might have an issue with it, but hopefully it's going to sit there, and then you're going to pass the turn, and the next person's going to be like, alright, cool, I'm going to tap 4 lands, take 4 damage, whatever the case is. You know, and then it's going to go around, and then what it's going to do is it's going to have players sit there and play fewer things, or that's what it's supposed to do. In Commander, when you start with 40 life instead of 20, it's a little more problematic. They have more life to play with to worry about. Where the card gets fun is when you add in the new Lost Caverns of Ixalan red god that says if a source you control deals damage, and that damage is less than this guy's power, instead that source deals an amount of damage equal to this guy's power. So now it's like, oh, I have Mana Barbs, and then normally Mana Barbs does 1. Well, this guy's normal power is 4. So now it's, you tap the land for mana, you take 4 damage. It gets even better if you're throwing in things that double and triple damage. So if you're playing both the effects that triple the damage and both the effects that double the damage, you as the player controlling all those effects can stack it so that 1 damage becomes 4 damage, and then you can double it to 8, double it to 16, triple it, and then triple it again. And at that point, it's ridiculous. Like, just tapping 1 land for 1 mana at that point is ridiculous, but that requires you to have 4, 5, 6 cards in play. You have to have the Furnace of Wrath, the Dictate of the Twin Gods, the Fiery Emancipation, the 8 mana Convoke version of Fiery Emancipation, the new God, and Mana Barbs. So, like, you have to have all those things in play. Well, Furnace of Wrath can be played on 4. Mana Barbs can be played on 4. Dictate of the Twin Gods is 5. Fire Emancipation 6. I don't know what that new red god is from Lost Caverns of Ixalan. I don't know how much he cost. And then the Convoke version of Fire Emancipation cost 8, but it has Convoke. So you can tap your creatures to help pay for the mana. So, you know, like if you go turn 1 land Soul Ring, turn 2 land, maybe turn 1 is land Soul Ring into Fire Diamond, and then turn 2 you could play Furnace of Wrath after you play land. On your turn 3, you could leave up mana and pass, and then flash in, because Dictate of the Twin Gods has flash, so you can wait to play it till the correct opportune time. As long as you have 5 mana open, it's 3 red. So then, like, you could just leave up your mana, pass turn, flash it in at 5. You know, your turn, you have 6 mana. You can play Fire Emancipation. Your next turn, you could play the new red god that I'm talking about, that I don't know his name and I don't know how much he cost. And then the turn after that, you could play 6, 7, 8. You could play the Convoke version of Fire Emancipation, so you could tap the red god so that you could pay it for 1 cheaper. And then on the following turn, you could play. So that's 1, 2, 3. So that's 1. This is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you could play mana barbs on turn 7, and then if everything gets to stick around and you pass, well, now players can't tap their lands for mana, because if they do, they die. I'm fairly certain that's enough damage to just kill. Like, you tap one land for mana. For if we triple it first, it becomes 12, and then if we triple it again, it becomes 36, and then if we double that, it's 64, and then if we double that, it's 128. So if they tap one land for mana, they take 128 damage, and it outright kills them. But again, you've got 6 pieces, you've got 6 things in play that matter. So if you get to that point, again, this is Magical Christmas Land that we're talking about. If you get to that point, you should just win, because now they can't play anything without dying. Like, they flat out die. 9 times out of 10, they flat out die. There's a couple of cards that'll make it so that they can't lose the game on their turn, or they don't take non-combat damage. There are cards that say that they can't take non-combat damage. If that's the case, your entire setup's at that point pointless, because all of that's considered non-combat damage. So yeah, like, I really feel like red is the worst color in, like, as a solo color, it is the worst solo color in Magic, period. If we were going on a color basis of, like, 2 color combinations, honestly, I'll have to probably get back to you in another video on that one, because 2 color combinations, there are a lot of 2 color combinations where red is included in as one of the 2 colors, where those are actually ranked a little higher than what you would think. But as a solo color, red is bottom of the pole, and not in a good way. For anybody that knows anything about totem poles, usually the totem on the very bottom is the most important, because it supports everything else. In this scenario, no, it is very, very bad. Very, very bad. It is there because over here, I believe it is poop. Now, that's all my personal opinion. 100% my personal opinion. If you don't have the same opinion, that's fine. You don't have the same opinion. No shame. No care. No shame. The second thing I wanted to get into today, I was talking to a buddy of mine a couple days ago, and he asked me to go over some stuff or a deck idea for a Orzhov. For the newer people that don't know Orzhov, Orzhov is one of the guilds, one of the 10 guilds of Ravnica. Ravnica is a world, or is a plane within the multiverse of Magic the Gathering, comprised of 10 different guilds. Each guild is 2 colors. So anytime you see decks with, like, 2 color combinations, people are going to refer to it as one of the 2 color guilds for Ravnica. White black is Orzhov. As far as Orzhov is concerned, for white black, Orzhov is just like Simic. It has a lot of commanders that are all over the place that kind of want to do the same thing, but don't really do the same thing. So what I'm going to do now is I've got it pulled up on the secondary portion. I've got my screen cut, so it's on the other portion of the screen. I'm going to try and go over a list, an Orzhov list of what I believe is, I don't want to say the best, but probably the most like put together, capable of consistent build up. Like, it's probably the way I've looked through it, it looks like it's going to be able to build up You're going to board wipe it. It's going to be like, oh, by the way, you did a board wipe. I have instantaneous board because of death triggers. So you'll have to board wipe again, and then then at that point you have to waste a secondary board wipe to get rid of the secondary board, and then on top of that, I'm going to rebuild, and then through rebuilding you'll have to board. Basically it looks like it's the most, in my opinion, it is the best non-aggro aggro deck because. At least in white black, probably in any of the colors, if I think about it. And the reason I say non-aggro aggro deck is because the deck itself is not built to be aggressive. It is built to maintain a level of control with the board state, specifically revolving around creatures and the board state, but not. So if you've been playing for a while, it's gonna sound and look, because I'll leave a link to the deck list in one of the comments. But if you go look at it, it's gonna look a lot like what most Magic players call an aristocrat deck, which essentially just means I'm going to play creatures, and those creatures are going to do things, and then at some point I'm going to sacrifice my creatures in order to do even more things. And usually, whenever I sacrifice my creatures, you as an opponent are going to have to do something you don't want to do, which could be losing life, discarding a card, sacrificing a creature of your own. Depending on what I have in play, you might be doing all three. Depending on how many variations of those things I have in play, you might be doing all three multiple times, off of me losing one thing. So it comes down to what I've got in play, what's out there, all that fun stuff. So the commander I've chosen for this list is Teysa Karlov. So Teysa Karlov is 2 white and a black for a 2/4. It says if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, you get an additional trigger. Also says creature tokens you control have vigilance and lifelink. So the first ability is really good for how I've gone through the deck and looked at things. The second ability is the key ability. Actually, the first ability is probably the key ability. The second ability is just an extra payoff. So the first ability is whenever something dies, if something I control triggers, or if I have a trigger go onto the stack because something dies, I get an extra one of those triggers. So the reason that's important in the deck is because I've actually looked through the deck, done some adjustments, and built it based off of the one of the Orzhov abilities. So that's the other thing, is every time we go to Ravnica, each guild gets some new ability. Like Golgari originally got Dredge was originally the gold. So if you play cards that have Dredge, it's from the Golgari guild. But then when we went back to Ravnica, they got Scavenge, and then they got something else, and I forget what the other one was. But one of the abilities that Orzhov got was Afterlife. So Afterlife is an ability on a lot of Orzhov cards that say when this card dies or is destroyed or something of that nature, when it goes from the battlefield to your graveyard, there's an Afterlife trigger that goes on the stack that gives you a number of 1/1 black and white spirit creature tokens with flying, based on the Afterlife number. So I've kind of looked through and changed up the deck to be more of this deck plays not a huge number, but a decent number of cards that when they die or are destroyed or whatever the case is, when they go from the battlefield to the graveyard, you get an Afterlife trigger. And Teysa Karlov, the commander, is going to double your Afterlife triggers. Now, all those Afterlife triggers are going to make tokens. So if Teysa is also in play when you attack with those tokens have vigilance and lifelink. So now you can use those tokens to attack and defend, and in both cases they're going to gain you life, as long as they deal damage. People can play things that prevent the damage. People can remove them from combat before they get to deal damage, whatever the case is. So again, the commander is Teysa Karlov. A lot of the a lot of the like token stuff is so real quick. There's Crawling Chorus. When it dies, it makes a token. The token can't block it. So Crawling Chorus is from the set before the invasion, the Aftermath. 2 sets before Aftermath. Phyrexia All Will Be One, I believe, is the name of the set. Crawling Course, it's 1 white for a 1/1. It's a Phyrexian horror. It has Toxic 1, so whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get a poison counter. It also states when it dies, you make a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. I mean, it makes a token when it dies, so it does what we want it to do. And if Tace is in play, whenever Crawling Course dies, we'll actually make 2 tokens. Those tokens can't block, but with Teysa, they will not only have Vigilance, they will also have Lifelink. We also play like Doomed Traveler. When it dies, you make a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying, so you'll double up on that. Garrison Cat. When it dies, it makes a... What does it say? It makes a 1/1 soldier creature token. Hunted Witness. When it dies, it makes a 1/1 soldier creature token with lifelink. So those are the ones that basically have afterlife without having afterlife. When they die, you're gonna make tokens. There's technically Doomed Dissenter. It's a 2-drop instead of a 1-drop. But it says when it dies, you make a 2/2 zombie. That's black. So it's another one. So Teysa doubles up death triggers. We're also playing Drivnod Carnage Dominus, which is the black Phyrexian god from the same time frame as Crawling Chorus, which is Phyrexia All Will Be One. I believe it's Phyrexia All Will Be One. And so Drivnod Carnage Dominus is an 8/3 for 3 generic black. It states if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of mine to trigger, it triggers an additional time. So it's also going to double up on our death triggers. But for 2 Phyrexian black mana, if you don't know what Phyrexian black mana is, Phyrexian whatever color mana is, you can pay that colored mana or you can pay 2 life. So in this case, it's Phyrexian black. So you can play your choice. You can pay your choice of black, 2 life and a black, or 2 life and 2 life in order to activate the ability. And the ability is to exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard, and you put an indestructible counter on Drivnod, which now makes it indestructible, so they have to exile it. Unless you use a sack outlet to save it. Like if they're going to exile it and you use a sack outlet to save it, you can. So it's going to double up on the death triggers. We also play Alinda the Dusk Rose. So Alinda the Dusk Rose is 2 generic and a white-black for a 1/1 Vampire Knight. Legendary creature, has lifelink. Says whenever another creature dies, so any other creature dies, you put a 1/1 counter on Alinda. When Alinda dies, you make X white vampire creature tokens with lifelink, where X is equal to Alinda's power. So with Alinda, Drivnod, and Teysa in play, if your opponents end up, like if your opponents are fighting amongst themselves and you have all these things in play, and like let's say each opponent has 5 creatures and each one of those players loses all 5 of their creatures, combat, sacrificing, whatever the case is. With all of these things in play, every time one of those creatures dies, Alinda's going to get 3 +1/+1 counters. So now Alinda has effectively 45 counters, because 3 times 5 is 15, and then times 3 is 45. So now Alinda's a 46 because she's a base 1/1. When Alinda dies, you're going to make 46 tokens, but it is a death trigger, so you'll do that 3 times. So 40 and 40 and 40 is 120, plus 18 is 138. So you'd make 138 tokens in total, because you'd effectively triple out the death trigger. We play Imperious Oligarch. It's a 2/1 for 2 with Vigilance, but it has Afterlife 1. We play Ministrant of Obligation. It's a 3 mana 2/1, but it has Afterlife 2. So when it dies, we'll make 2 tokens instead of 1. Obviously, since we're sub-token themed, we play Mondrak, Glory Dominus, which doubles out our token effects. So all these things that are making tokens whenever stuff dies through the Afterlife ability, or just says when it dies makes tokens. If Mondrak's in play, we also double up on tokens. So we have things doubling up on death triggers and stuff doubling up on tokens. So at that point, if you've got like Teysa in Magical Christmas Land, if you have Teysa, Mondrak, Drivnod, and where'd that other one go? Knight of the Last Breath. Knight of the Last Breath has a lot of text on it, but the text we're worried about is Afterlife 3. It's the only card that I'm aware of that has Afterlife 3. It's the only thing that I know of that says basically when it dies, you make 3 tokens. If you have Knight of the Last Breath, Teysa, Drivnod, and Mondrak in play, and you kill your Knight of the Last Breath, normally you get 3 counters, or you get 3 creatures. However, Teysa is going to give you an extra trigger. Drivnod's going to give you an extra trigger. Mondrak's going to double all of the tokens you would normally get. So your normal death trigger would normally make 3, but now Mondrak says you get 6. And then Teysa says, well, you get another iteration of that. So you get another 6. And then Drivnod says you get another. So then you get another 6. So you just made 18 tokens off of 1 creature dying. And those tokens are both white and black. So that's actually kind of important. Which I'll talk about why that's important a little later on. So like there are some key pieces to the deck that are like we're trying to, double up on death triggers, double up on making tokens. I tried to not put anything in the deck that you just basically take a turn off to play it, like Anointed Procession. Anointed Procession and Parallel Lives are both cards where basically the turn that you play it, assuming you're playing it on curve at 4 mana, whatever turn that happens to be, whether it's turn 2, if you can definitely do it on turn 1, but if you manage to do it on turn 1, you better have a really good turn 2 making tokens. But essentially they're cards that don't in any way have an immediate payoff the turn you play them, unless you have follow-up plays. And if you have follow-up plays, because they cost 4 mana to play, your follow-up plays have to either be cheap or you're later in the game. And if you're later in the game, it's probably not that great for you at the moment, and might not be that great for you for a couple of turns, because you're probably too far behind. So like we're not playing Anointed Procession in this list. We could, like you could definitely pull something out and put in an Anointed Procession if you really, really wanted to. But we're not worried about it. We play other things. Ogre Slumlord says whenever another non-token creature dies, any non-token creature other than itself, so it doesn't have to be yours, you make a black rat creature token. It also states that rats you control have death touch. So, again, commanders doubling up on death triggers, you're making extra rats. If you've got Mondrak in play, you're also making extra rats. So it's, the way I tried to build it was like, your commander's going to double your death triggers, but if your death triggers make tokens, there are things in the deck that say, oh, you also double tokens, so it's kind of like doubling the death trigger as well. So it's finding funky, spooky redundancies. It's a little harder than you would think. Another card that we are playing that probably doesn't see that much play at all. I used to play it. I really like this card. But as a commander, it doesn't do enough, and it kind of like gives away what your entire deck's supposed to do. But in the 99, it's really cool, assuming it gets to stick around. And that is Thalisi, Reverent Medium. It's 3 generic, white-black for a legendary creature, human cleric. It's a 3/4. It says, at the beginning of each instep, Make X 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying, where X is the number of tokens you created this turn. So at the beginning of each end step, you make X tokens based on the number of tokens you made during that turn. So like one of the themes you're going to see as I continue through the list is not only am I making tokens when things die, preferably, I have put in built-in abilities to, oh, my thing died, now there's an additional trigger on the stack, I can pay a cost and immediately bring it back. So now there's a way to kind of like build and loop things, not infinitely, but there's a way to build and loop things on opponent's turn to try and like either build a board state as you need it in order to be able to block creatures that are coming at you, or build a board state roughly at instant speed in order to, on your turn, win the game. I don't think I have anything in here that is a true infinite. There might be one or two things, but I'm not 100% positive on that. So that's like all of the things that make tokens. The only protection spells I'm playing is Teferi's Protection and Clever Concealment. If I need more than that, that's a little rough. That's a little rough because I'm already not guaranteed to see these, but if I need a third, I have to take something else out, and you either have to take it from you would probably have to take it from tokens. Tokens is the single largest among everything else in the deck. It's the single largest grouping of cards that does stuff. So if I wanted to put in more protection pieces, I would probably have to take out a token thing, and I really don't want to take out a token thing. For ramp's a little bit different. So for ramp, we're playing obviously Arcane Signet, Sol Ring. Those are the two big ones. We're also playing Orzhov Signet. We're playing the Talisman in our color combination. But we're also playing Marble and Charcoal Diamond. So the diamonds, they cost 2 mana, they come to play tapped, and they tap to add 1 colored mana of their respective color. Charcoal is black, Marble is white, Fire is red, Emerald is green, and I think it's Sapphire Diamond is blue. You don't see a lot of decks that play the diamonds because it's 2 mana, it comes into play tapped, and it'll only make 1 mana on future turns. You do, however, when you're in 2 colors, see the guild-specific Signet because it's 2 mana to play it. It's 1 generic mana into it in order to get 2 mana out. So you can potentially use it on the same turn you play it if you've got enough mana. Whereas the diamonds, you want to see the diamonds on like turn. You really, really, really want to go turn 1, untapped land, Sol Ring into one of your diamonds. Because otherwise, every following turn is a feel bad. Because it's a diamond it's a mana source that doesn't do anything the turn it comes in. There are cards you can play to make it so that you can use them on the turn that you play them, but at that point, you're using a slot to play things to make these things not as bad. It's not worth the slot, in my opinion. So those are all the big ones, but for ramp, but then we also play Pawn of Ulamog. So Pawn of Ulamog says whenever it or another non-token creature you control essentially dies, it's a really long wording before they shortened it to dies. You may put a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn token onto the battlefield. It has sacrificed this creature, add 1 generic mana to your mana pool. So basically, Pawn of Ulamog says whenever any creature that isn't a token that you control dies, you make a 0/1 token spawn that you can sacrifice for a colorless mana. So that's a death trigger, and it's making tokens at the same time. So our commander's going to double up on that, Mondrak's going to double up on that, Drivnaut's going to double up on that. So you're making, again, Magical Christmas Land. If you've got all those in play, Pawn and some non-token creature you control dies, the Pawn trigger alone is 1 becomes 2, 4, 6. You make 6 generic colorless. You make 6 tokens that you can then sacrifice for colorless mana from one thing you control dying. So Pawn of Ulamog's fairly useful in the list as far as that stuff is concerned. Sifter of Skulls. Pawn of Ulamog is 1 black black. Sifter of Skulls is 3 black. Has Devoid, so it doesn't have it. It effectively has a keyword ability that says it doesn't have a color, but for the purposes of deck building, it is color identified as black. If you are a newer player to the game and you are starting out by playing Commander, color identity matters a whole lot more 9 out of 10 times when you're building a deck than the actual color of the card. It requires a black mana to play it, even though it has an ability that states the card is colorless. If the rules for the format were a little bit different, you could technically play it in anything you wanted, but you'd never be able to cast it unless you could pay black mana. So that's the big reason color identity kind of matters. So because it is color identified as black, you cannot play it in any deck that does not have black in your commander in some way. And it has to be the colored mana symbol of black, either in the casting cost or an activated ability of your commander. One or the other. It has to be one of those. It states, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you make a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion token that has sacrificed this creature, add a colorless mana to your mana pool. So it does the same thing as Pawn of Ulamog, except it's a 1/1 instead of a 0/1, so it has a power, so if you need it to block and kill things, you can. But it essentially does the same thing. So those fall into your ramp package because it helps you ramp. So again, double, getting extra death triggers, making extra tokens, like you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff. In our draw grouping, there are only 6 cards in our draw grouping. One of those cards is Esper Sentinel. If you're a player who plays white a lot, you know Esper Sentinel. So Esper Sentinel is a 1 white artifact creature that says whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell of a turn, you draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is equal to Esper Sentinel's power. In this deck, Esper Sentinel's power should not be ever above 1. If it is, I've done something amazing because I haven't put in a whole lot of ways to buff any of the creatures. But essentially, it's the first non-creature spell an opponent plays on a given turn. If they don't pay 1, you draw a card. Or if they don't pay an additional 1 mana, you draw a card. But it'll only trigger on the first one. So if they're going to play like 6, you're only getting that trigger on the first one. It's not a bad card because it counts as a creature and it works as card draw if your opponents are trying to be really finicky with their mana and trying to play multiple things in a turn. But otherwise, I would prefer this deck have access to blue so that you could just play Rhystic Study. Rhystic Study is an enchantment in blue that basically every spell an opponent plays allows you to draw a card unless they pay one additional. You will only ever pay 1 additional, but it'll trigger on every spell, not just the first non-creature, not strictly non-creatures. It triggers creatures, non-creatures, enchantments, whatever. Your opponent's casting a spell. If they don't pay the extra mana, you may draw a card. That's the other thing. It's a you may instead of you must. Esper Sentinel is a you must. We're also playing Harvester of Souls. Harvester of Souls is a 5/5 for 4, black, has a death touch. It's a demon. Says whenever another non-token creature dies, any non-token creature dies, doesn't have to be yours, it can be an opponent's, you may draw a card. So I'm really big on the phrasings of you may do a thing because before they started putting the you may portion on cards and just having it be you do this if this requirement is met, one of the big things that players could do is they could just consistently try and make the requirement be met to force you to do whatever the thing was. A lot of those things were draw a card. Well, decks that are playing things that have extra effects that say when you meet this requirement, draw a card, those decks typically aren't playing ways to reshuffle their graveyard back into their deck. They're just trying to dig to their win condition and win as fast as possible. So if you, as an opponent of one of those players playing things that do that, if you could consistently trigger or cause the requirement to be met on whatever the card was that forced them to draw cards, you could effectively, forcibly cause your opponent to draw out and lose from that. It was a long shot, but I've seen it happen enough times to know that as a long shot, root for the underdog. We're also playing Priest of Forgotten Gods. Priest of Forgotten Gods is 1 black, 1 generic, and a black. It's a 1/2, says tap it, sacrifice 2 other creatures. Any number of target players each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. You add black, black, and draw a card. So basically, if this is in play, you can use it to sacrifice 2 other creatures. So you can sacrifice your creatures that have afterlife. If your commander's in play, you'll get double afterlife triggers. And then this thing will, this thing will let you basically choose every opponent you have, and then each of those opponents lose 2 life and have to sacrifice a creature, and you get to add 2 black and draw a card. Not the greatest thing in the world, but it ramps you a little bit. I don't know why it wasn't in the ramp section, but it also draws you a card, so it does both. It's also a fairly weak creature. It's a 1/2, so it's easy to kill, but it can be problematic. Like, the fact that you get to force an opponent's... any number... You have to be able to target your opponents, but as long as you can target your opponents, any number of target opponents, essentially, are going to do this effect. And then you get 2 black and you draw a card. We're also playing Smothering Abomination, which is 2 generic, black, black for a creature. It also has Devoid. Devoid is not an ability any of you need to be worried about if you're watching this particular video. It has flying, so it's up in the sky. It's a little harder to deal with. Says at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. If this is your only creature in play during your upkeep, you have to sacrifice this creature, because it doesn't say sacrifice another creature. It says sacrifice a creature. The other ability is, when you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. Now, when you sacrifice a creature is a little specific as to how this ability resolves. But it's also... It's a death trigger, but it's not a death trigger. I don't know. I might have to do a little more digging and looking that stuff up. But essentially, when you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. You want it for card draw. It makes it so that you have to sacrifice something on your upkeep. You have ways in the deck to be able to sacrifice stuff on other people's turn. And you can use most of those to also sacrifice things on your turn. But while you're waiting to get to those things, this will help you out. Do be careful, though. It does say that when you sacrifice a creature, you have to draw a card. It does not say you may draw a card. It says draw a card. So you have to do that. For the last piece of card draw. Absolutely love this card in this deck. We're playing Skull Clamp. So Skull Clamp is a 1 mana artifact equipment that costs 1 to play, 1 to equip. So a grand total of 2 mana to play it and equip it. Equipped creature gets +1, -1. So the fist end, I guess the chopsticks to the rice end goes up 1, so you get an extra chopstick for your rice bowl. However, your I don't know, spike in the toilet also goes up by 1. Normally toilets don't have spikes. Well, now there's a giant spike in a toilet whenever you have to go use the bathroom the next time or whatever. I don't know. Some of these, like, euphemisms probably aren't that great. But essentially it makes the front end bigger and the back end smaller. Normally, most players are like, I don't necessarily know that I like that. However, it has a secondary ability, which is the reason it's in here. It's the big predominant reason it's in here. And that secondary ability is whenever equipped creature dies, so we get double triggers from our commander because it's a death trigger, draw 2 cards. So if our commander's in play and we equip this to one of our tokens, most of the tokens we make are going to be 1/1s. Well, now the token we equip it to becomes a 2/0 and it automatically dies, triggering the Skull Clamp to draw us 2 cards. Well, because it's a death trigger, our commander says, no, you get another one of those. So we draw 4 cards instead. So it's really, really good as far as like being able to help us with drawing cards and the fact that our tokens are really, really weak. I've already gone over the protection. Oh, was it in here? Was it in this one? Oh, so one of the other ramp pieces that we're playing is Solemn Simulacrum. When it comes into play, search your deck for a basic land, put it in play tapped. Solemn Simulacrum costs you 4 generic. It's a 2/2. It's an artifact creature. You can put it in any deck you want. It also says when Solemn Simulacrum dies, draw a card. So it has a built-in death ability, which is going to double up with our commander. But it's one of the ramp pieces. There is another ramp piece. Where did it go? Because it's not there. Oh, we're also playing Ashnod's Altar. Ashnod's Altar says sacrifice a creature, add double colorless. So it's effectively a ramp piece, but it's a sacrifice outlet, so we can use it on everybody's turn to sacrifice creatures and get death triggers and do the fun stuff. So it fulfills 2 roles. It works as a free sack outlet once it's in play, and it generates mana off of us sacrificing things, so it can work with a bunch of our other pieces. However, Archidec puts all this in weird groupings. In the actual sack outlet grouping, it's only got 3 cards. Viscera Seer, which is a 1 black 1/1, sacrifice a creature, scry 1, so you can look at the top card of your library. If you don't like it, put it on the bottom of your library. If you like it, leave it where it's at. Woe Strider, which is, it does this, it's 2 generic and a black for a 3/2 instead of a 1/1. When it comes into play, you make a 0/1 goat creature token, and then it also has, you can sacrifice another creature to scry 1. So where the wording there is different. Viscera Seer says sacrifice a creature, meaning you can sacrifice itself. Woe Strider says sacrifice another. It cannot sacrifice itself. But they essentially do the same thing. One costs you 1 mana, one costs you 3 mana. Woe Strider also has an ability while it's in your graveyard. You can pay a cost, do a thing, and then also bring it back to play. A little bit bigger. And then in the sack outlet portion, we're also playing Yahenni Undying Partisan. Yahenni Undying Partisan is 2 generic black for a 2/2 creature. It's a legendary creature, Aetherborn Vampire? Yeah, Aetherborn Vampire. It has haste. It's one of the few black cards that have haste that I know of off the top of my head. That says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, so that's a death trigger, so Drifnod, Commander are going to double up on the death triggers, you put a 1/1 counter on Yahenni. But the reason Yahenni's in our sack outlet portion is because it has another ability that says sacrifice another creature. Yahenni gains indestructible until end of turn, so they have to use an exile spell. And it's all 3 of those creatures that I just named. It's sacrifice a creature, do this effect. It's not, there are a lot of cards that have pay a cost, then sacrifice a creature as the full cost, and then do the effect. These 3 are literally just sack a creature, that's your activation cost to put the ability on the stack, and then resolve it as needed. So those are really good. So there are more creatures in here than 2, but there are 2 just flat creatures they're just in here as critters. They don't fit with any additional themes that the Archidect webpage can figure out. And the first one is Greedy Freebooter. that says whenever it dies, you scry 1 and make a treasure token. That should not be strictly in creature, because it's a 1 mana 1/1 that when it dies is going to let us scry a card and give us a treasure token. So we get to kind of filter through the deck a little bit, and we get a mana to replace the mana that we paid to play it. So because both of those are death triggers, again with our commander, it's going to double up and be like, oh, you're going to scry 1 and make a treasure token, and then you're going to do it again. And then if we have our commander and Mondrak in play, we're actually going to make 2 treasure tokens every time we resolve this death ability. And then we also play Delaney or Delney, Streetwise Lookout. It's a newer card from Murders of Karlov Manor. It's a 3-mana white creature. It's 2 generic and a white for a 2/2. It's a legendary creature. It's a human scout. It says creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. It also says if an ability, which is really important for us because it means all of our 1/1 tokens can now almost, or our 1/1 tokens with Delney in play basically almost have the wording of this creature can't be blocked. There are a few things that will be able to block them, but those are very few within the range and scope of anything you would have to worry about. It basically makes all of the tokens that we're going to be making unblockable. So with Teysa, that's also really good because our tokens have Vigilance and Lifelink, and with Delney, they'll also effectively be unblockable. So it's like, free critter damage is great. But the big reason we play him is that second ability. And that second ability says, if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. So where that's important is the commander Teysa will get extra... the commander Teysa Karlov's ability, our commander, her ability that says if a thing dying would cause a triggered ability of a permanent that we control to trigger, we get an additional trigger. Well, that's actually a triggered ability. So Delney will give you an additional trigger of that. On top of that, any creature that we have that has a death trigger, and that creature has 2 power or less, when it dies, Delney will also give us an additional death trigger there. So Delney is going to double up on our commander's death trigger as well as any death triggers of any other creatures we control that have power 2 or less. So it's gonna double up in both departments. That first ability is good, but it's the second ability is going to allow us to double up in both departments and give us even more death triggers on the small creatures the small front end creatures that we have. I would say apart from Drivnod, Mondrak, the commander itself, Delney is probably on the same level of like all of those cards being highly important to our strategy. We have 6. We have what Architect believes is 6 pieces of recursion. That's Atheros, God of Passage, which is 1 generic, a white and a black for a legendary enchantment creature god. So Atheros, God of Passage is not a creature unless your devotion to white-black is 7 or more. For newer players, devotion counts your colored mana pips on permanents you control. You cannot count lands because they do not have a mana cost. It is strictly the colored pips among mana costs of permanents you control. So Atheros by itself has devotion 2 to itself because it cost a white and a black. And those are the colored pips in it. So you would need 5 more in a combination of white and black, 5 more devotion to that color before it becomes a creature to be able to do anything with. It's indestructible. Has the clause, as long as your devotion to white and black is less than 7, it's not a creature. All of the 2-colored gods from the Theros time frame have that wording. All of the single-colored gods say 4 or less. It's not a creature, so you'd have to have devotion 5. And all the single-colored gods give you 1 devotion to itself. Athreos also says whenever another creature you control dies, so this is a big one because it's a death trigger piece that can potentially matter. Return it to your hand unless target opponent pays 3 life. So where that's important is if one of our pieces die. Let's say, we have Teysa, Delny, and Drivnod in play along with Athreos, and an opponent kills our Delny, manages to kill our Delny, or whatever the case is. Well, when Delny dies, there's a trigger on Athreos. Well, there's also a trigger on Teysa to say, hey, we get an extra trigger on Athreos. Delny will actually see... No, because Delny will be dead by that point. But then there's also a trigger on Drivnod to give us an extra trigger of Athreos. So we can target one opponent 3 times with all of those triggers, and they have to pay 3 life in each instance in order for Delny to be in the graveyard. Otherwise, it goes back to our hand. If they pay 3 and choose not to pay anything else, it goes back to our hand. If they pay 6 and choose not to pay anything else, it goes back to our hand. They must pay 9 life. Now, there are effectively 3 triggers that go on the stack, so you could choose each opponent. If you're in a regular game with 3 opponents, you could target each opponent once and be like, hey, do you want to give this to me or pay 3 life? If they pay 3 life, you have another trigger. Hey, this guy, do you want to pay 3 life or give me my card back? If they pay 3 life, hey, do you want to pay 3 life or let me have my card back? You can target one player 3 times, or you can target each opponent once, or assuming you have 3 opponents, or you can split it how you want. But it's in multiples of 3. So that's really fun. That's really unique for the deck. But if you have ways to consistently trigger things like this with Athreos, people 3 life, okay, 3 life once fine, but 9 life where you get it back, or 6 life where you get it back, don't know that I want to do that. Here's the other fun thing. Once an opponent has less than 3 life, you can just target that opponent and then you just get the card back because they don't have the ability to pay the life. That is one of the rules of Magic, is if a card or if an effect of a card requires you to pay life, you can only pay an amount of life that you have that is equal to or less than the amount you have. But because Athreos' ability requires them to pay specifically 3 life, if they have less than 3 life, they cannot pay it, so you get the creature back. So that's a really fun interaction. It's really difficult interaction because if you have an opponent with less than 3 life, more than likely they're probably dead. So it's really difficult to kind of get one opponent to less than 3 life and then keep them alive so you can do your Athreos triggers as many times as you want within a turn, while also playing effects that are going to keep that player alive so that you can do that. It's really difficult in a game of Commander to do that, but that could be a possibility that you might see in one of your games if you're playing this list. Another recursion piece we're playing is Karmic Guide. Karmic Guide is 3 generic white for a 2/2 creature with flying and protection from black. When Karmic Guide enters the battlefield, you get to return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. During your next upkeep, if Karmic Guide came into play, you have to pay 3 generic, a white, and a white, which is essentially its mana cost, or sacrifice the Karmic Guide. That's the Echo ability. Echo's an old mechanic that I don't think will ever come back. I would love to see Echo come back, honestly. I really think that if they brought back Echo, it could be really fun to see the kinds of stuff that they put it on and all that fun stuff. There's also a card that combos with Karmic Guide depending on what pieces you have. I have the other piece, which is Revelark, that combos with Karmic Guide, but I don't know. I don't know that I have what would be if I do have an infinite loop in this deck somewhere, it's requiring a lot more pieces than most infinite loops in most other decks or colors. Karmic Guide and Revelark by themselves is not an infinite loop. You need another piece. I don't think that I play any of the other pieces to make it a 3-card loop to just do the 3-card loop and do whatever you want. I do believe that the loop that I might have in the deck requires 2 other pieces beyond the Karmic Guide and the Revelark, plus whatever one extra thing is, and it's not even a true full loop, because it will stop at some point. So Revelark, which is the other piece of that, says it's 4 generic and a white for an elemental. It has flying. When it leaves the battlefield, dying counts as leaving, but so does anything that says exile the creature and then return it to the battlefield, which is what we call a blink effect. That also counts as leaving the battlefield. Leaving the battlefield is more inclusive wording than strictly dies, because if it leaves the battlefield for any reason, dying is it has to die. It can't be exiled, blinked, bounced, whatever the case is. But leaves the battlefield is, if I leave the battlefield for any reason, exiling me, dying, blinking me, whatever the case is, as long as I'm leaving the battlefield, you get this effect. And the effect is you get to return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard with power 2 or less to the battlefield. Karmic Guide's power is 2, so you could get Karmic Guide and then one other creature with power 2 or less back into play from Revelark's leaving the battlefield trigger. Since in this deck it would effectively be through dying, it would technically trigger through death, which would make it a death trigger. You can double up on your death triggers, but then when Karmic Guide comes into play, you can bring the Revelark back, because Karmic Guide will let you get any creature from your graveyard back into play. And then as long as you can keep those 2 and other pieces here and there, you can effectively try and keep a board state in play. Another card which is part of our recursion package. It's not a huge recursion package, but the recursion this card offers might be important. And that's Sun Titan. It's 4 generic white for 6/6 creature giant, has vigilance. When it comes into play or attacks, you may return a permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can return you can return lands, because they are a permanent with mana value 3 or less. You can return any permanent, being planeswalkers, artifacts, enchantments, creatures that have mana value 1 or 2 or 3 or 0 when it comes into play or attacks. Something to note, the attack trigger portion just says when it attacks, so you get to bring something back before who or whatever you're attacking gets the choice to block. So what you bring back might affect how they decide to block, but you get to decide what you get to target and bring back the thing before they get to block. That is kind of important to note. We also play Luminous Broodmoth. So Luminous Broodmoth was a card that came out in Ikoria that saw some play in a couple of decks here and there, not a ton, and then once Ikoria left Standard, it kind of just fell off the bandwagon. But it's 2 generic white for an insect creature. It's a 3/4, it has flying, but it states whenever a creature you control without a flying counter, or without flying dies, specifically without flying dies, return it to the battlefield with a flying counter on it. So if you have this creature and Athreos in play, you have 2 triggers that go on the stack from a creature you control that doesn't have flying dying. And that is, target opponent may pay 3 life, or you get it back to your hand, or you bring it back immediately with a flying counter on it. Personally, if you have both in play, stack it so that the Broodmoth ability triggers first, or not triggers first, but resolves first. Because if you stack it so that an opponent has to pay 3 life or let you have it back in your hand before the Broodmoth's ability resolves, they're just going to let you have it back to your hand, because there's no point in paying 3 life knowing that you're going to get the creature back anyway, and when you get it back, it's going to have flying, so it's going to be a little harder to deal with. Just get it back immediately with the flying ability, and then when it dies again, because it has flying, it won't come back from Broodmoss, but then you can target with Athreos. Because if you do it the other way around, they choose to pay nothing, and it goes back to your hand, so now it's in your hand instead of in play. And you have to pay more mana and all that fun stuff. Yeah, guys, this is how cramped I am in here. I'm shooting this video, and the space that I have, like, I'm hitting my mic and everything, just trying to, like, go through all this. I'm not going to go through the lands. Like, again, I'll leave a link to this, but I'm not going to go through the lands. So as far as removal is concerned, our big low-cost removal options are Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares. Both of those cards cost you 1 white mana. Both of those cards are instant. Both of those cards exile target creature. Swords to Plowshares says the controller of the creature gains life equal to its power. Path to Exile says the controller of the creature gets to search their deck for a basic land and put it into play tapped. We also play Massacre Worm as a removal option. It's not a huge removal option, but against other token decks, Massacre Worm's going to come into play, give all creatures our opponents control -2/-2 until end of turn, and then it has a static ability of whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, so it's a death trigger, so we get to double up on our death triggers with our commander and Drifnod. That creature's controller loses 2 life, so now they will lose 4 life instead. We are playing Grave Pact, which says whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent has to sacrifice a creature, so it kind of helps us keep our opponent's creature board state under control. We're also playing Dictative Erebos, which does the same thing. The difference is Dictative Erebos costs 5 mana instead of 4 mana. Dictative Erebos also has flash, so you can cast it at instant speed. We're also playing Butcher of Malakir. Butcher of Malakir does the same thing as both Dictate and Grave Pact, except Butcher of Malakir costs 7 and is a creature. Again, Grave Pact, Dictative Erebos, and Butcher of Malakir all say when a creature you control dies, do this effect. Again, those are death triggers. So if you have your commander in play, each creature you lose while having one of those in play requires your opponent to lose 2 creatures. Assuming they have creatures. If they don't have creatures to sack, then the ability's irrelevant because they have nothing. For drain effects, because we're playing a lot of effects that are like when X, Y, or Z happens, drain opponents for whatever. Bastion of Remembrance, it's a black enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, target opponent loses. Is it target opponent or each opponent? Give me one sec. Each opponent loses 1 life and you gain a life. So again, that's also a death trigger ability, so our commander will double up on that effect. So every creature that we lose is going to cause our opponents to lose 2, and we're going to gain 2. Zulaport Cutthroat does the same thing, except Zulaport Cutthroat is a creature that costs you 2 mana instead of 3 mana. Vindictive Vampire does the same, with a slight caveat. Vindictive Vampire costs 4 mana instead of 2 or 3 mana. It is a creature, but it states whenever a creature you control dies, Vindictive Vampire deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So the reason that caveat's different is because there are effects that will allow you to prevent damage as well as preventing non-combat damage, because this ability is non-combat damage. It is an ability that triggers when things die. It will not trigger itself. Zulaport Cutthroat will trigger itself. Bastion of Remembrance triggers off of any creature you control dying, because Bastion of Remembrance is a enchantment and not a creature. So Vindictive Vampire will only trigger off of others, not itself. And its ability is damage based, not lose a life. So, you know, if your opponents are playing, there are a number of things that your opponents could play that literally reduce incoming damage from a source by 1. So at this point, the Vindictive Vampire would deal no damage to an opponent that has one of those effects in play. You would still gain a life, but your opponents wouldn't take any damage. And you might be asking, well, if you double up on that, wouldn't they at least take 1 because the total is 2? And it's like, no. The answer to that question is no, because what happens is if you're doubling up on the trigger, what you're doing is you're putting one trigger on the stack that says deal 1 damage to each opponent, gain 1 life. And then another trigger on top of that that says deal 1 damage to each opponent and gain 1 life. So when the first trigger resolves, the damage is reduced to 0. And when the second trigger resolves, the damage is also reduced to 0. So if your opponents have things that reduce incoming damage from sources by 1 or 2 or whatever the case is, this one's going to be a little different because while damage causes loss of life does not cause damage. Because this specifically states damage, there are more options available to your opponents of cards to play that can make it so that this particular card does not do a great deal, and this card is Vindictive Vampire. We're also playing Sir Conrad the Grim. Sir Conrad the Grim has an ability that triggers whenever a creature goes to a graveyard from anywhere. However, his ability will also trigger off of creatures dying, which will give us, we get to double up on that trigger when we have our commander in play and creatures die. However, Sir Conrad the Grim's ability is also damage-based. It deals 1 damage to each opponent. Again, if your opponents have ways of reducing or preventing damage from sources, this will not be as good. We're playing Cruel Celebrant, which is another form of Zulaport Cutthroat, except it's Orzhov colored instead of strictly black. We're playing Corpse Knight. Corpse Knight's a little bit different. So Corpse Knight is also Orzhov colored, but it states whenever a creature comes into play under our control, each opponent loses a life. So it cares about things coming into play rather than dying. But because we have things that say when they die, we make tokens, the tokens that come in trigger this guy and make our opponents lose life. We're also playing Ellis Ilkor Sadistic Pilgrim. It's Orzhov colored. It's a legendary creature. It's a 2/2 for 2. It's a white and a black for a 2/2. It has Death Touch. It also has 2 abilities. The first ability, the first non-keyword ability, is whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. A little bit of life gain might be relevant, maybe. The second ability is whenever a creature you control dies, whenever another creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life. That's the big one, is whenever another creature we control dies, each opponent loses a life. That's the big one that we'll be using. We're also playing Kokusho the Evening Star. Kokusho the Evening Star is from a set of legendary single-colored dragons from Kamigawa. Kamigawa is my favorite set. The original Kamigawa and Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Those are probably my favorite sets among any sets in Magic's history for as long as I've been playing. With the exception of Kaldheim. I like the idea behind Kaldheim, but I don't think it was done as good as it could have been done. But anyway, Kokusho states when it dies, each opponent loses 5 life, and you gain an amount of life equal to what the amount was lost total. So, like, if you have 3 opponents, normally when Kokusho dies, each opponent loses 5 and you gain 15. It is a death trigger. Things we're going to double up on death triggers. We're also playing Mirkwood Bats because we have a sub-token theme happening. And it says whenever you create or sacrifice a token, each opponent loses a life. So it's actually doubling up. In many ways, this ability is doubling up on things. When we make tokens, opponents are losing life. And then when we sacrifice our tokens for different purposes, they're also losing life. Again, I did say I wasn't going to go into the lands. So one of the recursion pieces that I didn't go over that we have is Nim Death Mantle. So Nim Death Mantle is a 2-mana artifact. It's an equipment that says equipped creature gets +2/+2, has Intimidate, and is a black zombie. Okay, not terrible. The equip cost is 4. Not the greatest. The reason we play Nim Death Mantle is for this next ability. Whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard, this is the old wording. The updated wording is whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you may pay 4 generic. If you do, return that creature to the battlefield equipped to Nim Death Mantle. So, if we have Nim Death Mantle and Ashnod's Altar in play and things that make tokens, or we have an abundance of creatures, or whatever the case is, if we have a way to generate 4 mana when a non-token creature we control dies, we can bring it back with Nim Death Mantle. So we use Nim Death Mantle in conjunction with Ashnod's Altar to generate colorless mana and produce loops to get all of the death triggers that we want to get, depending on what cards we're using to loop. So those are the bigger things. So I went into removal and didn't follow up with removal. We're playing Farewell as our only actual board wipe. So there's only one true board wipe in the deck. But Farewell exiles, and you can choose the modes you want. We're also playing Teysa Orzhov Scion. So this was the first Teysa that they printed in the first iteration of Ravnica. It's a legendary creature. It's a human advisor. It costs you 1 generic, a white, and a black. It's a 2/3. Says sacrifice 3 white creatures, exile target creature. That's good. Also says whenever another black creature you control dies, you make a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. So the reason we like the Teysa in here is for all of the afterlife effects. Afterlife, the afterlife keyword on most of the cards that we have that we play says when this creature dies, make afterlife number of tokens. These tokens are 1/1 white and black spirits with flying. So if we have 3 of those afterlife tokens in play, we can sacrifice 3 of them to Teysa's ability to exile a creature from the game. Just exile target creature. But because they're black, we can sacrifice them because they're white. But because they're also black, we generate 3 additional white tokens from those original tokens dying. And then we can sacrifice those to exile another creature. So she's just a really good removal piece overall. That being said, the only cards I have not covered in this list is the Kozilek Butcher of Truth and Ulamog the Infinite Gyre. Kozilek Butcher of Truth has a cast trigger. When you cast this spell, draw 4 cards. So it's in the card draw section. Ulamog the Infinite Gyre has a cast trigger. Whenever you cast this spell, destroy target permanent of your choice. Target permanent, destroy it, dead. The reason we are playing these cards... Again, I did mention I wasn't going to go into the full list of like all the lands and everything, but we are not playing Reliquary Tower in this list. We are not playing Reliquary Tower in this list because our overall goal is that the game takes forever, and we just get to run any various number of loops between like making a whole bunch of tokens, getting a whole bunch of death triggers, whatever the case is. We play the Kozilek and the Ulamog as a way to, once we have more than 7 cards in our hand during our end step when we go to cleanup to discard down to 7, we discard the one or both of them to our graveyard. When they go to our graveyard, they have a trigger that shuffles our entire graveyard back into our library. So it's a way to recycle our graveyard. They are both predominantly in the deck as ways to recycle our graveyard back into our deck. That being said, there might be times, if you play this list, there might be times where you have to play them. You have to cast them. They get to come into play kind of deal and whatever. We, over here at Cardboard Kitchen, do not plan on ever attacking with these creatures. Because that is rule number 2 of Cardboard Kitchen, is Legendary Eldrazi can't attack. And the reason that is a rule in Cardboard Kitchen is because of the Annihilator trigger. Nobody likes Annihilator. I know very few people that like Annihilator, and the few people that I do know that like Annihilator, they don't like it the way it is. They want it to be changed to be a little more specific on certain aspects and do a little bit more. So they don't even fully like it the way it is. Most people just don't like it as an ability. But we don't attack with it because we don't want that trigger happening. We don't want somebody to have a feel bad moment. We predominantly play it for the, if it goes to our graveyard from anywhere, we get to shuffle our graveyard back into our deck. Because I do understand that you will probably have games where you have to play these cards. That is why there are so many different things in the deck that say, sacrifice a creature, do this. Once they are in play, you can then sacrifice them to one of those things. You get the trigger from them going to your graveyard from anywhere, as well as whatever the other thing ability is that you sacrificed it to. Oh, this is a long video. We are pretty much at the end. If you've stuck around, thank you so much for sticking around and watching this all the way through. I know I've rambled a lot, jumped here, there, wherever. If you liked the content, give me a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Leave a comment. Like I said, I'll try and link. I'm definitely going to link the list that I just discussed in one of the comments. I will also try to make sure I link the Facebook page in one of the comments. If I can get to 150 subscribers by the end of April, I will make a Patreon and figure out the levels for the Patreon, and then also do a Discord channel where you can interact with me and other people in the Discord as time permits. I still got to talk to a few people who might be interested in being moderators if I manage to get to that point. I'm really hoping to get to that point. I know that we can do this as a community, and this would be really, really fun, really, really good as a community. That being said, if you're new and you stuck around, thank you so much. Again, like, comment, subscribe, share it. That's probably another big thing that I haven't been stating. Once these videos get uploaded, I post them to the Facebook page, and then I try to share them with as many people as I am allowed to share them with based on the numerics. And then I also try to post links in a couple of other Discord groups that I'm in that have self-promotion tabs. But if you are somebody watching this content and you have friends that also play the game, maybe haven't heard of me, heard of the channel, whatever the case is, definitely share these videos with them. Let's get these videos going around. Other than that, thank you for being here. I appreciate everybody who's coming back and watching these videos. With that being said, I'm going to end it here and get everything set up so it can start processing, and then I'm going to go to bed because I have an early appointment in the morning. So I will talk to you guys later. Bye.